The Forum Boarium had the scent of moist stone and cattle waste. Beneath its open expanse, 3 pairs of men in armor stepped into a temporary fighting area. They were not military personnel, but enslaved individuals trained for mortal combat, not for honor, but to commemorate the departed. This was in 264 BC, when Decimus Junius Brutus Scaever had just buried his father. To mark the occasion, he organized what the Roman historian Livy later referred to as Rome's first documented gladiatorial contest. At this time, it was not yet a public event, but a funerary custom, which Romans called a munus, a duty owed to the deceased. The combatants shed blood not for recreation, but as a solemn tribute. However, this private rite, originating from the Campanian tradition of human sacrifice at burial sites, soon evolved. In southern Italy, particularly in cities such as Capua, these sanguinary ceremonies had already begun to alter. The Samnites, former adversaries of Rome, had long hosted warrior duels during feasts for the dead. Over time, the act of ritual killing became ritualized combat. The act of death itself became less significant than the struggle. It was, as the Christian author Tertullian later observed, the shedding of blood for the sake and satisfaction of the dead, yet one that increasingly captivated the living. By the end of the 3rd century BC, these contests were transitioning from funerals to public festivities. No longer limited to mourning ceremonies, they began to appear in Rome's growing schedule of ludi, games approved by the Senate. Initially religious in nature, the ludi Romani were held in honor of Jupiter, frequently during periods of crisis. The Senate, fearing divine displeasure or seeking divine favor, would vote to fund these events, thereby making the games a matter of state rather than private sorrow. This shift from a family-centric ritual to a civic performance was subtle but permanent. The Senate's involvement expanded. Magistrates, particularly aediles, exploited these spectacles to garner popular approval. Blood became a tool of politics. Death became a public exhibition. By the close of the Republic, temporary wooden arenas were succeeded by stone amphitheaters. What began as a solemn observance in a muddy form had been assimilated into the Roman state, codified, scheduled, and publicly financed. Thus, with each drop of blood spilled on the sand, the state itself was establishing a novel form of law, not engraved on tablets, but inscribed in stone. Gladiators were compelled to fight famished beasts. The iron gate groaned open, and a hush fell over the assembled crowd. From the dimness of the arena tunnel, a solitary figure emerged. Barefoot, scantily clad, carrying only a short blade. Across the sand, the cage door ascended. A lion, its ribs pressing against its matted fur, stepped into the sunlight, emaciated, vigilant, and tensed with hunger. This was not a contest. It was an execution orchestrated for public excitement. By the 1st century, CE Roman arenas had transformed into venues not only for human combat, but also for man's forceful confrontation with wild animals. Known as venationes when presented as hunts, or damnatio at bestias when utilized for executions. These spectacles were designed to blur the distinction between punishment and entertainment. Condemned criminals, prisoners of war, and occasionally even rebellious slaves were cast into the arena against lions, leopards, or bears, often weakened by hunger to guarantee a swift and brutal end. This practice had earlier origins. By the late Republic, generals like Pompey had grasped the political efficacy of spectacle. He famously arranged shows in which men were pitted against animals in elaborate displays, scenes where blood offered both retribution and applause. The more dramatic the death, the greater the perceived triumph of the state. However, not all who encountered the beasts were condemned criminals. Some were professionally trained fighters, bestiarii, who were either coerced or compensated to combat wild animals for the crowd's amusement. Mosaics and stone reliefs from the early empire depict such scenes with stark detail. A figure with a raised spear as a lion attacks, a net wielder evading the claws of a panther. A relief from the 1st century CE shows a fighter staring directly into the eyes of a charging beast, captured mid-movement in sculpted terror. These were not imaginary events. In Roman Britain, archaeologists uncovered the pelvis of a man, likely a gladiator, bearing deep bite marks consistent with the jaw of a large feline. The wounds silently narrated his fate. He had perished in combat with a lion. Across the empire, from the Colosseum to provincial amphitheaters, this ritual of blood was repeatedly enacted. Seneca, writing in the 1st century CE, recounted how some prisoners would take their own lives to avoid their appointed spectacle rather than suffer a death intended to entertain others. Their refusal represented a silent act of defiance, a final assertion of control in a world designed to strip them of it. What transpired in the arena was not mere aggression, it was calculated degradation. Hunger was weaponized. Beasts were starved not only to ensure death, but to amplify suspense, to keep the crowd in breathless anticipation. As man confronted claw, fang, and destiny in Rome, law and spectacle proceeded hand in hand, and the roar of a lion was not merely nature unchained, it was the voice of power, both nourished and deprived, to serve the state. Following this, the text introduces Rome's deadly water shows, known as naumachiae. The water gleamed beneath the Roman sun, tranquil for just a moment. Then drums thundered, war horns rent the air, and two complete fleets surged towards each other across an artificial lake. Soldiers stood on ships, armed with spears and catapults. Below them, thousands cheered, not from riverbanks but from stone seating areas. This was not warfare, it was entertainment. Rome called these naumachiae. These were simulated naval battles fought not in distant seas, but in specially engineered basins, often commissioned by imperial decree. Julius Caesar staged the first in 46 BC near the Tiber River. He had an artificial lake excavated to reenact a battle between Tyrrhenian and Egyptian fleets. Real ships, real weapons, and real men, condemned prisoners, fought not as performers but as soldiers with no expectation of survival. The scale of the spectacle expanded. Augustus, Caesar's heir, constructed an enormous basin in 2 BC, measuring 1,800 by 1,200 Roman feet. It was so vast that it necessitated its own aqueduct, the Aqua Alsietina, to fill it. On these waters, 30 warships engaged in combat, each crewed by thousands of convicted criminals. The magnitude was astonishing, the message was unmistakable. Rome could command not just armies, but nature itself. Sometimes these water shows extended beyond artificial lakes. In AD 52, Emperor Claudius drained Lake Fucine, a mountain lake, and celebrated with a naumachia. The combatants famously greeted him with words etched into history. Morituri salutant, which translates to, "Those who are about to die salute you." Whether these words were prescripted or uttered spontaneously, they encapsulated the profound fatalism of men sent to their deaths for public amusement. By the time the Colosseum was inaugurated under Titus, naumachiae had become synonymous with imperial splendor. Some historians believe he may have utilized Augustus's nearby basin for naval battles during the amphitheater's dedication ceremonies. Later, under Domitian, similar games were potentially staged within the Colosseum itself. Its arena floor was temporarily flooded to host miniature maritime carnage. Even during Trajan's reign, a century after Caesar, the tradition endured. He constructed the Naumachia Vaticana in AD 109, a massive flooded arena near the Vatican Hill where more battles of spectacle and death unfolded before roaring crowds. Each Naumachia was more than a mere performance. It was a demonstration of absolute control. Over water, over men, over the entire empire. In these carefully orchestrated wars, Rome did not merely reenact conquest. It recreated domination as a ritual, drawing power from the illusion that warfare could be staged and yet still remain absolute. By the time of the Colosseum's grand opening in AD 80, executions were no longer solely punitive. They had become theatrical. Emperors, beginning with Titus, used the midday interlude between gladiator matches to stage mythological tortures. These were not symbolic dramatizations. They were actual deaths designed to mimic the agonies of legendary figures. Martial, the poet and an eyewitness to those inaugural games, recorded what he observed. He described an Orpheus-like figure entering the arena to charm wild beasts with song. But unlike the myth, where nature submits to Orpheus's music, the arena's animals were unmoved. A bear mauled the performer on cue. Elsewhere, a man portraying Daedalus, the mythical inventor who flew with wax and wings, was torn apart by another beast. Martial, with biting irony, wrote how the performer must have wished for his feathers then. One of the most unsettling reenactments involved the myth of Pasiphae, the Cretan queen cursed to lust after a bull. Roman crowds witnessed a woman, or possibly a condemned man in disguise, thrown to a beast in a distorted imitation of her fate. The performance blurred the boundaries between myth, punishment, and voyeurism. Fire also played its part. The tunica molesta, a garment saturated with pitch, was fastened to the condemned and ignited. Sometimes this was framed as the death of Mucius Scaevola, the Roman hero who proved his loyalty by holding his hand in fire. Whether the victim portrayed Scaevola or another fiery martyr, the result was the same. Screams were drowned out by applause. Tertullian, a Christian writing under Roman rule, acrimoniously described how victims were burned alive, tied to posts, and mocked as actors in a play of torment. "We are mocked as kindling men," he wrote, recounting executions where men were transformed into living torches, with pain masquerading as a moral spectacle. These mythological tortures were not about telling stories. They were about control wrapped in ritual. Rome did not merely kill. It made death an echo of divine punishment, providing the audience not with justice but with a perverse form of catharsis. And so, as legends were resurrected in blood and flame, the boundary between theater and execution collapsed. In the Roman arena, myth was not read, it was re-experienced. Rome's arenas turned ritual into policy, spectacle into statecraft. Blood on the sand, water and flame forged a culture that measured power by the choreography of death. Their echoes still haunt every debate on violence and entertainment. The text then poses a question. Which spectacle, funeral duels, bestial hunts, naumachiae, or mythic tortures best exposes Rome's command over life itself? It invites readers to comment below with their insights. As Seneca wrote in Letters to Lucilius, "I come home more greedy, more ambitious, more self-indulgent, yes, even more cruel and inhuman because I have been among human beings."